Good afternoon. I'd very much like to welcome everybody to this talk, which is the first in the new series of DPU webinars on post-COVID-19 urban futures. So I'm Robert Biel. I'm a member of DPU staff, and this is the entitled From Crisis to Radical Change. So I'm really grateful to the DPU for setting up this series, and it's a fantastic idea, showing and exploring together really how we can transform this difficult situation into a really positive opportunity to change things for the better. I've put some numbers in my presentation so you can follow where I am, and so I'm starting with point 1 here, and this is something of the background because this talk in a way grows out of a project I've been involved in for a short time, which is to try to look at how we could bring about a change to sustainability. And it's been clear for a while that the deadline is fairly short and that we have to bring about a very fundamental system change, most obviously in terms of reducing carbon emissions, but also in terms of making radical changes to safeguard and restore biodiversity. There's a deadline of 2030, which is often talked about, and so this doesn't seem such a long way away. And so this is kind of the way that we were looking at this in the recent period before this outbreak. Can we transform the world in 12 years? And the problem at this point seemed to be how we could free ourselves from business as usual, so we were imprisoned within this trajectory and we would need to break through it. So what has obviously changed today is that it is no longer business as usual, and this provides us with a very exciting opportunity, I think. So going on to point 2, there's a number of concepts which I was exploring already to look at how we could vision the change which we need to bring about for the future. So it's the issue of visioning is really important, and visioning is kind of it could be utopian. That's great. It's looking at the kind of world that we want to have, but in order to arrive there we also need some dialogue with the past, because we need to restore a connection with the way in which humanity has existed in a very close symbiotic relationship with the environment over the whole of our history, almost the whole of our history. And so this is sort of looking back to indigenous perspectives, and so the dialogue with the future is also a theme of returning to that. Going on to point 3, so just to give one example, I've been very interested in the work of Joy Harjo, who's a Native American poet who has been given a post of poet laureate in the US, and this particular work, which is a map to the next world, is sort of drawing upon the indigenous visioning, which was a very deep experience, I think, of negotiating ecological shifts in the past, and how we can kind of draw upon this in the current situation. So I mean, this was written several years ago, but it's very, very apposite now, and I think this connection is something very, very important that we need to look at. So what is it that actually went wrong and which we need to repair? So this takes us to point 4, and there is this idea which is really important in political ecology, which is the notion of the death of nature. And this is something which was put forward by Caroline Merchant in this very important book, which again goes back several years, and it really traces the point where things began to go wrong to a period which happened to be that of nascent capitalism, and the dimension which she looks at is the dispossession of women, but also a changed kind of paradigm about how we deal with nature. And so there began to be a kind of perspective of dominating nature, controlling it, and making it easier to access, and digging everything which was formerly hidden out into the open. And so these are all issues which the ecofeminist perspective connects with the dispossession of women. But more broadly, we could also look at it clearly in terms of the colonial events which were happening at the same time. So we're talking about the 16th and 17th century and so on. So this is a thing which needs to be kind of repaired. And what we draw from political ecology is kind of understanding the intrinsic links between the ecological and social dimensions in doing that. And so this is really something which I want to explore in this presentation, and look at how these two aspects can be intrinsically and qualitatively linked together. Okay, so looking at how we repair the death of nature, I'm going on to point 5 now. So there is this principle which I picked up on, which is called biophilia, and this is an idea which was developed by Erich Fromm. And so Fromm was writing against the background of all the terrible things which happened in the 20th century, the two world wars, the rise of fascism, and so on. It's biophilia means love of life, and it's kind of the starting point for it is social and political, and you know that this is very relevant today because we have this horribly corrupt and degenerate political kind of climate which is around at the moment. And so he was seeing it from this angle. You know, he was dealing with kind of dictators who just kind of were quite happy killing people. But obviously I think that the term biophilia is implicitly ecological as well, and so this is kind of an important idea. The way we relate to people and the way we relate to the ecology could be along similar lines. And if we can arrive at this could be a way of repairing the death of nature and reunifying society and ecology in a progressive kind of sense. So this is what I was kind of trying to find a way towards. And this takes the argument onto point 6, which is the concept of care. So I think care is something which somehow brings together these two aspects of how we can have a relationship of biophilia, both with each other and with the natural world. You're caring for both people and from nature. And so I drew inspiration from Marina Chan, who's my former PhD student, who's now kind of mentoring me in some of these explorations. And so she developed this notion of care in a very significant way in her PhD thesis. And I think this is something which we can connect with Erich Fromm's ideas and take forward in this sense. Okay, going on to point 7. So what was wrong about the death of nature is partly about trying to simplify systems in order to control them better. And if you simplify the chains of cause and effect, then you can make the systems predictable. So then the systems become linear. If you do something, you know exactly what's going to come out. And this gives you a kind of sense of control, or maybe an illusion of control, which is both a technical paradigm and a political one. You know, so you think that you can control nature through science by making it more predictable, and at the same time you are also controlling these processes in a political sense, and you can exploit them. So it's this link which is a very important one, I think, if we're looking at exactly how the death of nature operated and then how we could actually put it right, which is very much connected, going on to point 8 with what's been going wrong now. And the basis of the outbreak of the virus is something which will have to be traced. But I think the hypothesis now is that it was a disruption of the ecosystem, and that what we're really doing is by destroying the complexity of the system, by depleting biodiversity, we're cutting off the spontaneous mechanisms of regulation within the system, which can prevent some aspects from getting out of control. So in this sense, I mean, going on to point 9, I'm saying that biophilia is not just about loving life, but about being in tune with life. And I see this in really in quite a musical way. So we're vibrating in sympathy with life, and we're understanding how these processes operate, which opens us up to complex system thinking and restoring natural balances. And if we practice agroecology, for example, in food growing, which I've done a certain amount of practical research on, and then you kind of learn that you don't really want to try to predict too much. Almost having a obsession with predicting things is counterproductive to what you're trying to achieve. It's much better to allow the system to take its own course, and anything which we might identify as a pathogen or as a insect pest is controlled by some kind of spontaneous corrective feedback. So we don't know exactly what this is going to be, but it happens somehow. So I illustrated this from my own experience, and you can see that this is an illustration from when I'd been away from my plot for actually several weeks, which in conventional farming you're not supposed to do. But in this case, I was very confident by just allowing everything to develop in a free and spontaneous way. You get a kind of chaos of a good kind. It's a creative kind of chaos. And then if you get a proliferation of slugs or something, then this toad will come in to eat them up. So this is kind of an example of these spontaneous corrective feedbacks, which is a form of spontaneous self-organization, which is a characteristic of complex systems. So this is really what we want to have. And this is what we need to get back to. And just going on to point 11, this notion of being in tune with the natural operation of complex systems is something which works very well for the design of built systems. And so this connects very much with the theme of this webinar series about urban futures, and I think the later presentations will deal with this in more detail, but it's certainly something which we can transplant from the dealing directly with nature as we do in agriculture to things which are dealing with artificial built systems of our own. Okay, so going on to point 12, if we aspire to implement biophilia and to restore the spontaneous operation of complex systems and that kind of thing, we need to overthrow the control structure which at the moment is preventing this from happening. And so this connects up with another important theme, which is the notion of biopower. So in a certain sense, I think biopower is the opposite of biophilia. So biopower is something where you are the dominant system has as its primary objective to control systems. And so this term is something which was put forward by Michel Foucault, and it's a very stimulating idea which he didn't have a chance fully to develop in his lifetime, but it suggests a number of directions in which we could take it, and so I'll try to explore this a little bit in the course of this talk. Okay, going on to point 13, and this is again something which is really uh, extremely significant if we're looking at the control structures. In other words, what is stopping us from making the progress that we need is imperialism. And so in this particular case, I'm drawing upon the work of Rosa Luxemburg, who made a fantastically important contribution around the beginning of the 20th century. And just to emphasize that the aspect of imperialism which she was somehow explained in a really important way was the way in which capital accumulation operates by depleting a kind of surrounding system, or you could call it the periphery, which is a term from dependency theory, or you could call it environment, which is the term which is used in the English translation of her work. But in the original, she uses the French term milieu, which means kind of whatever is surrounding what is happening and what you are embedded in. And so this milieu is both a natural system and a social one. So the more that capital accumulates, the more it is kind of depleting nature and, in a certain sense, depleting society. And this is also institutional, because there is a sphere within society which is what we call the commons. So the commons is a way of kind of democratically managing certain resources, which is also a way of nurturing and sustaining them. So in that sense, the traditional institutional approach is intrinsically something which supports and sustains nature in a biophilous sense. So the more that capital accumulates, the more it kind of destroys that. It kind of eats this up, and it consumes this surrounding system in order to gain its own kind of nourishment for its development and accumulation. So it's sustaining itself at the expense of the environment, and at the expense of people, and at the expense of the institutions of society. So we'll explore a little bit about how that's happening now. Going on to point 14. So drawing this part of the argument together, in order to challenge biopower, to challenge imperialism, this has to be achieved if we are to inaugurate the regime of care. So this kind of sums up this part of the argument. Okay, so what I've talked about up to now is about some of the concepts. And so what I want to look at now is a little bit about the more recent history. And going on to point 15, this is sort of the pathology, because I think society was sick even before the virus infected us. And it's this sickness which is really important to get to grips with, because we have to understand this sickness if we are going to move towards a constructive solution of the post-COVID-19 situation. So a basic argument of this, which I want to draw upon to kind of introduce this, is the notion of phase transition. And any kind of system needs to be able to transform itself, to restructure itself radically and fundamentally at certain points in its history. Otherwise, it becomes stagnant. So this is something which is a characteristic of natural systems. It's a characteristic of human systems, and it's a good thing, and it's a necessary thing. We need to keep developing. We need to stop ourselves becoming stagnant. And we can look at the ecosystem as a kind of paradigm for explaining how this happens. So this is one way in which it can be done. And so this little figure of 8 diagram is from the ecologist C.S. Holling, and he is looking at how a particular ecosystem, and this could be a forest or something like this, works. And it is not really it's not stable. It's not stable in a kind of stagnant sense. It is very dynamic. Nature is extremely dynamic, and it needs to be able to disrupt the established pattern of its operation at certain periods. And so you can see this in the bottom left-hand corner. And this is a situation where the line of development is torn. It's torn apart. It's ripped. There is a rift, and this rift is phase transition. And this is a really good and positive and necessary characteristic. We have to have this kind of phase transition. Point 16. However, this is my argument, capitalism has managed to, in a way, usurp this faculty of phase transition and turn it into a mechanism of its own development. Capitalism, like everything, has got to not be stagnant. It's got to somehow continue disrupting the previous structures, and whatever cozy and embedded habits it has accumulated, it needs to be able to kick these out at certain times. It has to be unsentimental in destroying its previous structures in order to break through to a new cycle of development. And this is something which capitalism has learned to do. It's a kind of parody of an ecology which it's taken on board as part of its own development. And there are different ways in which we could see this, going on to the diagram below. So you could call it long cycles, you could call it regimes of accumulation. There are different terminology for it, which I won't go into in detail, but I just wanted to show that it operates in a certain way which is analogous to an ecosystem. And so I unpicked Holling's diagram and laid it out along a line. So this is the top part of this diagram, and then the bottom part is one of the typical ways of representing the waves or long cycles within the capitalist economy. And you can see that there are, in both cases, there are four phases. There's a phase where the system is exploring the potential of the structure which it has got. Then there's a phase where it becomes rather embedded, and it's no longer able to explore new things, and then it becomes stuck, and then it has to break apart. And so this is kind of something which is universal to all systems, and I think it's something which is a way in which capitalism has learned to operate to prevent itself from becoming too stagnant. And the point at which the system is torn or ripped apart it can be represented by the notion of creative destruction. This is something which comes from Schumpeter, who was one of the guys who was talking about how capitalism was able to prevent itself from becoming stagnant. And the notion of creative destruction is a really, really interesting one, which is something which takes on board some of the fundamental realities of the way in which systems operate, incorporates this faculty into capitalism, but of course in an exploitative sense. So capitalism has learnt to practice creative destruction, but of course its default setting is to grab the creative part for itself and push the destruction onto the masses of the population. And so it's this kind of way in which it tends to destroy society through the process of its ongoing development of itself as a system. So it is able to develop as a system for itself, but it's eating up or consuming society at the same time. Because of all the destruction which it produces. And so it's this kind of dialectic which I think is really important to try to understand. So I'm going to explore a little bit about how this has happened in recent periods. But this notion of the way in which capitalism has usurped the faculty of phase transition, I think, is something which is a really interesting application of the biopower idea, looking at it in a structurally systemic way. Okay, going on to point 17. So if you look back to the earlier diagram, so you have this succession of waves, and at some point you ask yourself naturally the question of what is the next wave going to be, and this is a little bit of a difficult issue to answer from a capitalist point of view, but there is within the literature, within a certain a certain population of the the apologists or spokespeople for the capitalist system, then there is this very strong argument that the next wave would be green, and this kind of has got quite a lot of logic behind it. So going on to the diagram below point 17, so you can see that you have this succession of waves, and then there is this green wave which takes over. This is a wave of high innovation, and it's got all sorts of implications about energy systems, circular economies, recycling, and this kind of thing. And so this would be great, and I think it's something which, if it happened, it would obviously be quite a exciting possibility. But the problem is the way in which this opening has been cut short, and this takes us to point 18, which is the crisis of 2008. So in my argument, this was quite a significant watershed because there was a rift. So we said that looking at Holling's diagram, looking at the way in which capitalism has taken this on board, so you need to have these rifts in order to carry out creative destruction. But where was the creativity? The system was disrupted, it was broken apart, but what did it build after that? And so this is a really big question. Going on to point 19, and I think this is the important point if we're to understand the nature of the rift. It is a point of disruption which was both socio-economic on the one hand and ecological on the other. And this is probably something new in the history of capitalism, to have a major ecological crisis happening at the same time as a socio-political one. And the important thing, if we look at that particular crisis, was the way in which the two interacted. So in 2008, the finance system became very unstable. You had the dot-com boom was bust, and companies were going bust, and it was very difficult to invest money. At the same time, you had major ecological crisis, which was leading to extreme weather and food shortages. So food shortages, Australia and other places, which were supplying a large amount of the food to the global markets. So you had food shortages, and at the same time you had a situation where finance could not invest in anything. So what happened? What happened was that the money, speculative capital, went into buying up land. so that if you had more land then and food became scarce, then the land would increase in value, and so this was the way in which capital could profit from the ecological meltdown. And so this interaction was very important. Of course, this instituted a much longer term process in which the value of land has been constantly increasing the more it becomes kind of monopolized by a narrower range of interests. And so this was a significant feature that you began to get a kind of interaction between these two types of crisis. So going on to the diagram below that, Aroma Revi from the Indian Institute for Human Settlements, who's worked quite closely with the DPU in the past, and he was exploring this in 2010. So I went to a presentation where he was looking at this interaction, and this slide, which I pulled off the web from his presentation, it shows this in quite an interesting way. He's actually got a pandemic there, among other things. The diagram below that is one that I published, where I was looking at this connection as well. The point I'm making is not exactly the same as Aroma's point, but the two are quite closely related, and so this suggests that the interaction between social and environmental problems will become a feature of the coming period. And I think this is something which we're confronting now as well. This was obviously triggered by the current crisis was triggered by an environmental issue, but it has uncovered very deep problems within the socio-political and economic system of humanity. And so we will have to understand how the solutions, the way in which we come out of the crisis, is connected with the way in which we can restructure our own human systems. So this is a feature which has been there since the 2008 crisis, and I think it's something which will confront us in the future. So going on to point 20. So because I think the reaction to the 2008 mixed ecological and socio-political crisis was a failure to conduct deep systemic change. And this has led to a phrase which is often used about this period from 2010 up to today, the lost decade. And we can explore a little bit about what the meaning to this might be. Looking back to imperialism theory and just bringing a couple of points out of this, there are two key things which were put forward as characteristics of imperialism in the early debate, in the early debate of the early 20th century. Firstly, finance capital becomes dominant, and it becomes dominant over the productive economy. And secondly, that it's always a kind of a simpler solution to exploit the periphery, to exploit the global south, to exploit the poor and the masses of the population, rather than carry out deep reform. So these are characteristics of imperialism, which was often described as a kind of decadent phase of capitalism, and this has been quite significant in enabling the system not to reform itself in a deep and creative way. So the lost decade has been paradoxical, because going on to page 21, point 21, it's true that the green transition has been initiated to some extent, and that diagram where the green wave came about has come true to some extent, notably in terms of energy transition. So now we have a situation where renewable energy is becoming cheaper than fossil fuel energy, and in fact the fossil fuel economy is being somewhat artificially maintained by state subsidies and so on. otherwise it would probably melt away. Coal has become a museum piece. The coal mining museum in Kentucky has installed solar panels because it's cheaper, and so this is kind of quite an interesting development. So the green transition is there, and obviously this raises the possibility of abundance, that we could have solar energy which would allow us to escape a lot of the restrictions and develop creatively in a new kind of way. And so this would be really fantastic. But on the other hand, and going on to point 22, the transition in this direction has been blocked in important ways. And I think imperialism is still very much there. The kind of exploitative flows of imperialism are probably more important than the benign flows of circular economies, and it is still cheaper and more attractive for the ruling order to maintain fossil fuels as a way of somehow providing a basis for its monopoly of power within the international system. The big powers have invaded several oil-producing countries like Iraq, Libya, Venezuela, or operated to overthrow the system there. So anybody who has tried to use petroleum resources in a way to fight against the domination of the global north has been destroyed, and the old kind of economic structure is still very much there and is preserved by imperialism. Because this fundamental change has not been carried out, society has somehow become embedded in a stagnant situation where it is predating upon itself. It's squeezing value from the base and shifting it to rewarding finance capital. So the problem which was faced immediately in 2008 when the banks started going bust was for the governments to try to stop this happening by putting resources into the finance sector. But this was initially supposed to be a temporary solution to get out of that crisis, but of course it became something embedded permanently, and so value was constantly being transferred further to the finance capital, exactly in the way that imperialism theory had predicted that was going to happen. So there's a kind of lesson here for the way in which you get out of crises, that this should not be happening by financing and subsidizing the sectors who are causing the crisis. So let's try to remember that lesson and act on it this time around. So we have somehow had this situation where, on the one hand, we have had this really great stuff with renewable energy and decarbonization, not fast enough, but it's been there. On the other hand, we have had no association at all with improving social equity. Quite the opposite, because the ruling order has been predating upon its own social base and has actually been destroying society and drawing value out of society to feed the finance sector. So there were these two very contradictory features, and there may even be a negative correlation between the green energy transition and social equity. If we look at this article, which I reproduced below, is a really fascinating study, because it shows that the countries which are more advanced in terms of green energy tend to be the ones which are less equitable from a social point of view. So this is pretty shocking, and it would be great if it was the opposite, but it's really good having this research to show us that that's not true, and this is something which we urgently need to break through. So I think this sort of destruction of society is something which is actually preventing the green energy transition from realizing the potential which it seems to have. Somehow the greening and the social decay are contradictory aspects of the same reality. Point 23. So this takes us to a point which it's an idea which I found quite helpful in trying to understand how this social depletion was working, and this is a concept called the foundational economy. You can search that term on the web, and it will take you into some of the literature, but it comes out of the University of Manchester, and this tradition in Manchester of putting forward interesting socially progressive economic ideas. And the foundational economy is really the sector which sustains life. And it is education, it is health, it is the small local businesses which are providing for people's consumption and so on. And so the argument about the foundational economy is that if you're trying to restore society and in a way to bolster the strength of society and its capacity to absorb and heal itself from a crisis, if you want to do those things, you ought to be putting resources into the foundational economy. So I like that idea, and the way I'm kind of extending it in terms of the theory I put forward at the beginning is I'm connecting it with biophilia, I'm connecting it with the regime of care. Okay, so it's about care, and this is the thing which we want to build, but this is exactly the thing which has been destroyed during the lost decade, and it was destroyed in the name of austerity in the European context, and so we are undermining the sector which sustains life just in the situation where we need it most. We've moved further away from biophilia, and biopower has got worse, by the same process, because I think they're interconnected. One goes down and the other goes up. So it's this connection which is rather amazing. So going on to point 24, this is just one example of this, but I think a very significant one, because it enables us to explore the link with biopower a bit more, which is the surveillance of the most marginalized populations. And so a good example of this is people with disabilities. So in the UK context, there has been a huge amount of policing of people with disabilities, which you can see in this little extract which I've put in below. And this connects up with the biopower idea very strongly, because it was actually Jeremy Bentham who put forward the notion of this kind of society of surveillance, which was really weighing down upon the marginalized and the people who are outside the mainstream, really. So you can see the front page from his book. He put forward the notion of the panopticon, which was a surveillance system which was operating to keep these guys under control. And it was by looking at Bentham's work that Michel Foucault first developed the biopower idea. Okay, so this takes me to the final part of this presentation, and this is point 25. And so now I want to begin to look at what the new situation can offer us. So we have had this background of the lost decade. We have had intensified depletion of society. We've destroyed the foundational economy. We've weakened our ability to withstand this kind of crisis. But what has changed, which we can use in a creative sense, if you like? We've had the destruction. Let's have the creation. Okay, so first point, there has been a rift. Um, it was something which was not obvious how this was going to happen until the crisis took place, but there has been a rift. The continuity of the system has been broken. This is absolutely clear. And do we want to get back to where we were before? This is the thing, the ruling discourse is saying, yes, let's get back to where we were. But the system before was on a completely destructive course, and society was consuming itself in the interests of finance, actually. Um, there is this projection from Chile, which is saying, yes, we don't want to get back to normality because it's normality which was the problem. So we want to break this trajectory, and um, the destruction has happened. We don't necessarily like the destruction, but it opens up the possibility for creativity. It's not a question of going back to the way things were before. They have to go forward to something new, something completely different, and this is really, really important. Point 26. Connected with this, really, activists were calling for the declaration of an emergency over the climate issue. We had a lot of rebellion from below about the destruction of Earth by a capitalist society. There's a picture of a protest from Ghana, and below Extinction Rebellion in the UK. We're very pleased in the DPU and in the Environment and Sustainable Development masters that both of these struggles, graduates of our course have played a leading role, and we have this activist transition which we're very, very tradition which we're very, very happy about. So there was this mass movement from below calling for change, but it was largely ignored. The notion of a climate emergency, yes, there was a cosmetic declaration passed by the UK Parliament, but nobody took it seriously. But now we accept there is an emergency. It's not a normal situation. So this is a kind of step in the direction of what people were calling for. We now need to draw the necessary conclusions from that situation. Point 27, which takes us back to the foundational economy. We are forced as a society to be dependent on those sectors which are precisely the ones which are under attack, the sectors of care. So I received this message on my dumb phone from the UK government, which says protect the NHS, and this is pretty amazing coming from the Tories, who had been trying everything they could to destroy the NHS, and now even the official society has got to rely on that because there is nothing else to support us. And so this is the economy of care, the society of care, the regime of care, which hopefully we can restore. Following on from this, point 28, can we write off neoliberalism once and for all? Please, let's do that. I think this is very much overdue. It's been overdue since the 1990s. It's been well overdue since the 2008 crisis, but it keeps on carrying on in an embalmed form and continues to be worshipped. And it's neoliberalism which has been particularly destroying the sectors which we now need to depend on. And so let's just get rid of it. So that this is something which there's an illustration there from the Gilets jaunes in France, and they were campaigning really against the government, which is putting forward pure neoliberal policies. And the Gilets jaunes are saying yes. They are very explicitly putting forward the notion of care. So this is a really great feature, I think, which is something which we can build upon. So this takes us to point 29, and there will have to be a stimulus package to get the economy running again. So this is accepted. This um, opens up a situation where there will be a lot of state intervention in the economy, and which is obviously completely counter to neoliberalism. It's also something which has been explored in some of the progressive policy debates around the notion of a Green New Deal. And already there are discussions around what the in a way using this stimulus package to promote an ecologically sustainable restructuring, which is also linked with social equity. So this is a debate which was there sort of in the margins before around the Green New Deal idea, but it's now moving into the mainstream. And I think this so it's not a question of creating something out of nothing, because there is going to be the stimulus package anyway, and so now we have a much more concrete basis to push this in a Green New Deal type direction. Going on to point 30, and this is building again on the Green New Deal idea, but this has always been seen in an international context. And when the idea was first put forward, right at the beginning of the lost decade in 2010, it was already argued. This was from the UN Environmental Programme. It's a very good document, this, and very far-sighted, I think. They were already saying that the Green New Deal, which is based on, yes, state there will be state expenditure and planning and so on, but it won't be done on a nationalistic basis. It has to be done on an international basis. I think from the standpoint of what we've been saying about imperialism theory, then it's clear this has to be the case, because the reason the system has been able to afford the luxury of not reforming itself is because it has been exploiting the periphery. And all of these type of flows, the exploitation of the physical environment of the people in the global south, all of these kind of issues which Rosa Luxemburg was talking about, have always been used to make the system reactionary and prevent it from moving in a progressive direction. So these are issues which really have to be addressed in terms of any meaningful notion of a global Green New Deal. And going beyond this, I think already some of the responses to the crisis are international, and this will only increase in the coming period. And I think this opens up a very progressive possibility of a new cosmopolitanism. So we had been stuck in a very evil kind of dichotomy between the kind of internationalizing facet of capitalism, which is taken over by neoliberal globalization, became very discredited. And then you got right-wing nationalism as a reaction against that. And so this was a very unproductive and uncreative kind of conflict between two things which are both really bad, and they are twin evils which have somehow got locked into some kind of parody of a struggle between themselves, and this has robbed us from it's one of the many ways in which we've been diverted from the changes that we need, and the solution to this is to build cosmopolitanism on a new kind of basis. I think we really are well equipped to begin to do that. Lots of movements like the food sovereignty movement, which have been questioning the conventional definitions of politics in a creative way and so on. So let's open ourselves up to that now. Point 31, the thing which seemed unattainable, which is the slashing of emissions and pollution. Suddenly it's happened. And so we have got a drastic reduction of carbon emissions. Pollution has slowed to practically nothing through the lockdown. And these kind of debates, again, which are illustrated by this little snippet which I put in here, and are really quite enlightening. I didn't even know that there are 48,000 deaths in France alone caused by pollution. And this has been drastically reduced by the lockdown. So that this is creating a very new kind of situation. This quote I took from the World Meteorological Organization. You could see it as an experiment. What happens if all of a sudden we turn the whole thing off? So that's quite an exciting idea, and this really invites us to think differently. Looking at the illustration below that, I saw this project by an Australian photographer who asked people who are self-isolating to appear in their window holding a placard which illustrates something about their thoughts. So this woman is saying, the machine can stop. And this is something which we have illustrated. We can actually halt emissions, we can halt pollution, we can do it. And the challenge, the immediate challenge, is to see how much of this reduction we can embed permanently. I think the deeper challenge is, to take on board the fact that the machine has stopped and can stop, and how can we, if we restart things, if we restart society and economy, do it in a radically different kind of way. Point 32, just to say that this has big implications for the design of built systems, and this links in with the urban dimension of this series, and it points forward to some of the issues which will be explored in later presentations. 33, and this is bringing things to a close, but possibly one of the most important deductions of all, which is that resilience somehow becomes the criterion of everything. And this implies different ways of organizing physical systems, but also society. I just put in the cover of these two books, which there is quite a lot of literature out there, but these are ideas which we can draw upon now, which shows how systems which are decentralized are much more, they have a much higher degree of immunity to a threat, to disruption, to exactly the kind of challenge which we're facing now. And the way in which it operates is that they decentralized systems can regenerate themselves from anywhere. They create their own kind of nodes and interactions which don't have to pass through a center, and there is they have a very high ability to improvise solutions. There is a high degree of redundancy, that is sort of surplus capacity in solving things. It's connected with open source technology, so that we have got forms of software, machine designs, which we share freely on the web, which people can modify and make available to others. And so this is a kind of ongoing process where there are communities who are working on technical improvements, but at the same time, this is also a recipe for society. It's a decentralized society. It's a society which operates in a different kind of way. And so I think the point 34, which is really where this whole argument is leading to, the faculties which we require for resilience have got to be anchored in society and diffused throughout society. So we're not destroying society any longer, we're building society. This is the pathway to resolving the death of nature, resolving our alienation, bringing us together with the ecosystem, and at last bringing together social equity and environmental sustainability in a progressive kind of way where they reinforce each other. Thanks very much. It's been great having you part of this project, and I hope this will be part of a very productive and creative ongoing discussion. Thanks.